More listeners than ever. The latest from podnews.net with AdvertiseCast. Nielsen released a new Podcasting Today report with data from Edison Research and Nielsen Scarborough Podcast Buying Power. The total US podcast audience has grown 68% in the last 5 years, with the number of Hispanic listeners almost doubling. Comedy is the most popular genre. You can download the report in full from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Nearly half of all podcast listeners have used a podcast to help them fall asleep. And more than 3/4 have used a podcast for relaxation, says new research from Acast. The company suggests that this is a great opportunity for advertisers. Half of podcast listeners who use them to fall asleep remember the ad the next day. Transistor's Justin Jackson has posted a review of his experiences at Podcast Movement.
Whenever I come back from the conference, I'm inspired. It makes me want to go create more, do more podcasting. And then on the Transistor side, it makes me want to create the best podcast hosting tool that we can.
We link to that in full from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. In Australia, the ABC's If You're Listening podcast has added a video version. In the last year, the broadcaster says multiple surveys have found increasingly large numbers of people want the option of watching their podcasts, not just listening to them. And Mike Jensen, the CEO of Rhapsody Voices, is interviewed in the Podcast Business Journal this week on when video is right to add to an audio podcast.
You know, I really enjoy the exploratory conversation with content creators because sometimes you'll find in the middle of the conversation, especially if it's on a Zoom or face-to-face, that they're jumping to life in a video format, right? Whereas there are certain cases where you just want to have a conversation, right? You don't necessarily want to be on camera. And I think that in every instance, we have to look at what are all these different aspects of the people, the content, the show, and say, is this additive with video? Or is it prohibitive?
You can read that in full at podcastbusinessjournal.com later today. And thank you to Dave Beasing, the CEO of Sound That Brands, for becoming a personal supporter of Pod News yesterday. Thanks to Podium Podcast Company, the podcast growth agency, for becoming our latest supporter. Corporate supporters like Podium or personal supporters like Dave all help us lessen our reliance on advertising and ensure our reporting is as independent as possible. And you can support us too at podnews.net/support. In People News, Friedhelm Tauber is Podimo's new country manager for Germany. He replaces Sebastian Romanus. And in podcast news, Nathan Gathright is the guest in this week's Pod News Weekly Review, talking about his new transcription service.
We support all of the Podcasting 2.0 formats. Especially my favorite is JSON because I really appreciate word-by-word fidelity, but we also provide it in SRT, VTT, and TXT files.
Sam also asks me about my time at Podcast Movement last week. You'll find the Pod News Weekly Review wherever you get your podcasts. Also today, Sisters Assembled is releasing its 100th episode today. It looks at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The state of Texas today joins the 20 or so other US states restricting access to medical therapies and procedures for transgender children. In Radio Atlantic today, Trans in Texas looks at what's next for the thousands of young people who identify as transgender in the state. Is it time to leave altogether? The Murder Years is a new scripted crime podcast inspired by a true story. It's produced by Air Media and distributed by iHeart Podcasts. TMZ has released Fake or Fact Britney Spears, a dive into the world of pop culture's most iconic figure. Happyful Finding What Works is new from the UK Mental Health magazine. The show is solution-focused and talks about our mental, physical and emotional health. It's hosted by Kat Nichols. And Chameleon, Gallery of Lies is new from Campside and Sony Music. This season chronicles the rise and fall and potential rise again of one of the most powerful figures in the global art market. This podcast is sponsored by AdvertiseCast. AdvertiseCast connects thousands of podcasts with thousands of advertisers and has been matching podcasts with brands since 2016. Find your fit. Join AdvertiseCast, the premier podcasting network, at advertisecast.com. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.